Hey Optimancers, Chris here, doing another Friday video, and today what I want to talk about is something that probably isn't going to have the mass appeal that I get when I do a review of new subclasses or class or do builds, but this is a conversation that comes up a lot, and that is, what is the difference between practical optimization and theoretical optimization? What even do those terms mean, and why is it important to know the distinction? So that is our topic for today's video, but before we get into it, what I want to do is thank some of my patrons. So I have a Patreon, and if you're interested, take a look. The link is in the video description. But what I want to do is thank some of my highest level patrons, and just want to mention that these patrons allow me to do this with the amount of research I put into them and time I put into them. I wouldn't be able to do that without these people. So thank you so much today to Airhead, Awesome Face, Ben Potts, Bloody Nine, Cass Byrne, Christian Wyndham, Comfy Baphomet, and Douglas Reynolds. Thank you so much for your continued support. I really, truly appreciate it. So let's get started talking about theoretical and practical optimization. Okay, so when we are talking about optimization, what we're talking about is getting the most we can out of the rules. And when I do this channel and I do my builds, I am thinking about how to get the most out of what I'm working on so that you could take it and play it at a table. And that is exactly what practical optimization is. So when I look at, say, a sleep spell and I go, that looks like it'd be really good at low levels, I let you know and you could take it to your table. And this isn't something you have to ask the DM's permission for. You took the sleep spell, you use the sleep spell, and it's clear by the wording of the sleep spell how it works, and I've just come up with the evaluation that it's good at low level. And when you're doing practical optimization, that's what you're doing. You're using the mechanics of the game, and you're trying to make your character or the party meet challenges effectively. Now, theoretical optimization is different. With theoretical optimization, what we're doing is really just kind of a thought experiment where we are looking for rules interactions and ways that rules can work together in ways that the designers probably didn't intend and is probably not intuitive. That doesn't mean that theoretical optimization can never be used at a game table. I have heard of and I've played in adventures where the DM has been on board with theoretical optimization, but this is something that the DM probably needs to tell you, not that you should be asking the DM about. I think it's actually bad form to be asking your DM about theoretical optimization. If they want to use it, they're going to let you know, and if they don't let you know, I think the assumption should be it's not allowed. And honestly, if I'm running a campaign where I don't want a bunch of tricks, then the last thing I want is to constantly have to tell players no. Now, I've been told that that means that the DM is making house rules, but actually, here's the dirty secret about theoretical optimization. None of it is technically fully supported by the rules. In every single case that I have come across, when I look at the rules as written, it is not fully supported in the rules, and I'm going to go into that with a couple examples later in this video. The mechanics of the game of Dungeons & Dragons were largely created by Jeremy Crawford, and he's kind of considered to be in charge of that aspect of the game. And when he was asked about rules and why we would even need something like sage advice, what he said was, and I quote, "The rules are a tool, and we want our tools to be as effective as possible. No matter how good those tools might be, they need a group of players to bring them to life and a DM to guide their use. The DM is key. Many unexpected things can happen in a D&D campaign, and no set of rules could reasonably account for every contingency. If the rules tried to do so, the game would become unplayable. An alternative would be for the rules to severely limit what the characters can do, which would be counter to the open-endedness of D&D. The direction we chose for the current edition was to lay a foundation of rules that the DM could build on, and we embraced the DM's role as a bridge between the things the rules address and the things they don't. And this is so important when we talk about theoretical optimization, because the rules are constructed in a way where they tell you what you can do, and they place certain limitations on that. But those limitations are not comprehensive, and this is by design. Let's look at one example of this. And the Barbarian basically has a signature ability we call Rage. And what Rage does is it's going to give you advantage on strength checks and strength saving throws. We're going to do a little bit of extra damage with weapons. You know the deal. Now, when we look at the rules for Rage, number one, it tells you what you can do. On your turn, you can enter Rage as a bonus action. But then it also tells us some limitations. You only get the benefits if you aren't wearing heavy armor. If you're able to cast spells, you can't cast them or concentrate on them while raging. The rage is going to end after a minute. It ends if you fall unconscious. It ends if you haven't attacked a hostile creature since your last turn or taken damage since then. Now, the thing we need to understand is this is not a comprehensive list. On our turn, we can enter rage as a bonus action. Does that mean we can enter rage using our action or a reaction? Because the rules don't say we can't do that. So what we see is that there's this gap between what you can do and what you can't do, because we have a lot of things that simply aren't covered. And again, this is by design. And so with practical optimization, our base assumption would be if the rules say we can do it, then we can. But if the rules don't specifically say we can do it, we can't just make the assumption that we can just because the rules didn't say we couldn't. And that is the primary way we can actually differentiate between theoretical and practical optimization. Here's another example where the gap in the rules between what you can do and what you can't do is the difference between practical and theoretical optimization, and that would be Druid armor. So with the Druid, if we look at the class features, they have armor proficiency. They have proficiency in light armor, medium armor, shields, but then it says in parentheses that a Druid will not wear armor that has metal in it. But there is a difference between saying that they won't wear armor and that they can't wear armor. So then the question was asked to the designers. So what happens if the Druid puts on that metal armor anyway? And the designers made a joke and said, the Druid explodes. But then they follow it up and they say, okay, not really. What actually happens is it's up to your DM. We're not going to tell you what happens when your Druid wears armor. And you can have a conversation with your DM, and if they decide that your character doesn't have to follow that taboo, but if they do, then they're going to have to decide what happens if you put that metal armor on, whether you can continue as a Druid at all. So as a practical optimizer, I just make the assumption that I cannot wear metal armor. But a theoretical optimizer will look at if I can get my DM to go along with this, because the designers have said specifically that you don't necessarily have to not wear metal armor, then I can make a more powerful interaction. Now, there are some cases where we see rules interactions that the designers probably didn't intend that are rock solid. And these are few and far between in actuality, but one example would be the way Magic Missile interacts with Hexblade Curse. So if I'm a Hexblade and I put a Hexblade Curse on somebody, every time I roll damage, I'm going to be adding my proficiency bonus to that damage. And when I cast Magic Missile, whether you're using a single roll and then multiplying it by the number of missiles, or whether you're rolling separately for each missile, because that is the way it's done at a lot of tables as well, either way, clearly the Hexblade Curse bonus damage is going to apply to every roll you make. So either way, it's going to be your proficiency bonus added to every missile you fire. So in those cases, I don't consider that theoretical optimization anymore. But I will tell you that the vast majority of tricks you've heard about are not those kind of cases that are not rock solid within the rules. And I will say that when we're talking about good form and bad form for players, I don't think it is bad form at all for you to ask a DM whether Hexblade Curse plus Magic Missile works the way the rules say. In fact, I think it's good form because I do think you should ask. But the DM would have to actually make a house rule to have that not work. So as I said, on this channel, I try to stick to practical optimization. But when we are optimizing characters, there is a very different mindset we go to when we are using practical optimization versus theoretical optimization. And there was a big divide amongst the optimization community well over 10 years ago, back in the days of 3.5, which was a very rules-heavy game, and we kind of created this official distinction between practical and theoretical optimization. And a user named Salic came up with a list of 10 requirements in order to determine if something qualifies as practical optimization instead of theoretical optimization. And it was called the 10 Commandments of Practical Optimization. And the thing is I read this today and it still applies. And this list still appears online. If you want to check it out, I'll put a link in the video description. Number 1, not everything needs to be stated explicitly in the rules. Some things just are. A human doesn't have 157 arms, even though the rules don't explicitly say that he doesn't. The core rule books tell us what is, and then they provide certain limitations, but there are certain things that they just leave to common sense. If the designer spelled out every single thing explicitly, even the glaringly obvious, the core rule books would be unreadable and unplayable. The second one is the biggest one, in my opinion, and that is the rules don't say I can't is not practical optimization. And when I read theoretical optimization, even if it's not labeled as theoretical optimization, this is usually my first clue. It's when a trick is explained by the person who came up with it, and they will explain it as the rules don't say you can't do this. And that's a sign that you're not dealing with practical optimization. The third is raw as a myth. And when we are talking about optimization, we always talk about the rules as written, or raw. D&D cannot be played without interpretation and the judicious application of common sense. Try to play the game strictly and exclusively by the rules as written, and the game is unplayable. Because we have this gap between what the rules say you can do and what they say you can't do. And if we don't have a DM filling in that gap, then this game is unplayable either way. If we're only playing by what it says we can do, there's just not enough options to actually play. And if we're only playing by what it says we can't do, then it creates a bunch of silly situations that again make the game unplayable. But with theoretical optimization, always we take that gap and we make assumptions on behalf of the DM. And always to their benefit and not always to common sense. Which brings us to the fourth, common sense is not a bad thing. The rules are designed to be read with common sense. And yes, that varies from person to person, but there has to be some basic level on which we agree with core assumptions, or the game's meaningless. And here's one way to really determine the difference between a theoretical optimizer and a practical optimizer, and that is the fifth one, that intent matters. Now, I'll get told, of course, you can't know the intent of the designers, and that's true. But some cases we can. Sometimes the intent is obvious, and other times the intent has been clarified. Jeremy Crawford is really good for letting you know how the rules are intended to work. And I think there is a significant distinction between a rule being vaguely worded, so we don't know the intent, and to say the rule is vaguely worded and therefore I can ignore the intent. And the sixth one, I think, is something that a lot of people are unforgiving about, and that is mistakes do happen. The reality is everybody's human. I'm a human, and the folks at Wizards of the Coast are human. Jeremy Crawford is a human. Sometimes humans make mistakes. When we have an artificer that, at one time, had homunculus rules and steel defender rules that allowed for a loophole where if your proficiency bonus increased, certain aspects of that creature would increase, and it didn't say that they went down again if your proficiency bonus went down. The question was, what if we reattune an Ion Stone of Mastery over and over again? Can we get infinite bonuses for these creatures? Theoretically, the answer is yes. Practically, the answer is obviously not. The seventh rule of practical optimization is simple is good, as in we should have a bias towards the simple. That doesn't mean I'm never going to do a build that's going to dip a bunch of different classes, but I will tend to have a bias towards going with a more simple build and just coming up with the best options for that, because it tends to be more widely applicable to players who can use these builds without having a bookshelf full of books. Now, no matter what kind of optimization you are using, let's just be clear that tricking the DM is bad. And if you ever have a question about, can you help me trick my DM or help me break the DM's game, I'm not the person to ask. I am a practical optimizer and I want your DM's game to be successful. And frankly, if you're asking that question in the first place, it leads me to believe that you're probably a toxic player. And this isn't even a practical optimization versus theoretical optimization thing. If we are doing theoretical optimization and we recognize it as theoretical optimization, then it isn't done as an attempt to trick your DM or break your DM's game. It's done as an attempt to just show what can be done within the rules as a good thought exercise. And in that respect, it is perfectly fine. The ninth rule applies more to people like me, who do the builds, and other people sometimes use those builds. And sometimes I'm asked for doing particular builds. And the rule is that I should respect the parameters of the request. So if I'm on my Discord and I go to build discussion and somebody's asked, hey, I want to make a monk, I shouldn't be going in there and saying, you should not play a monk, you should play anything else because monks suck. I might warn you, but if that's what you want to play, then I'm going to optimize that to the best of my ability. Whenever I optimize anything, I'm always going to have a limited environment to work within. Sometimes those limitations are mechanical, sometimes those limitations are conceptual, but if those limitations don't exist, then I'm kind of wasting my time because I could just give you the best build and we're done. But we have different concepts for characters and we have a desire to try different mechanics for characters. And part of optimization in a practical sense is to give people those little options and then we get a new environment from which to optimize. And I'm very honest with people that when they ask me to optimize a monk, I let them know that I haven't figured out a good way to do it yet. And I've done a video on that to explain why I have those problems. But if you are aware of those problems and that's still what you want to do, it's not my place to tell you to do otherwise. And the 10th rule, I think this actually applies more to people who are accessing other people's work than it is to the people creating the work. And that is, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff now that you really thought was legal up to now, but I'll explain specifically why it is not legal without some judgments by the DM covering gaps in the rules that is up to them to decide. So I'm just going to provide a few examples here, and the reason I'm doing this is I want you to be able to decide for yourself the difference between theoretical and practical optimization. And the reason I figure this needs to be done is because we have people out there right now doing theoretical optimization who do not differentiate between theoretical and practical optimization. They think that, number one, their tricks are perfectly okay to spring on your DM and take to your table. And number two, they think that their tricks are fully supported by the rules. And they're not. What I've also seen are theoretical optimizers in perfectly good faith who come up with these tricks and they're very clear that this might break your game. I just came up with this and I thought it was kind of neat. But what happens is these tricks move beyond the optimizer. So they go from person to person and what was once theoretical then just becomes a trick and it's not labeled as theoretical or practical. So then people see it and they don't necessarily know that it is intended to be theory only. So the first trick I'm going to talk about is the rope trick. We can pull up the rope from a rope trick and other creatures can't enter it. So what if on our turn we drop the rope? We climb down 5 feet, we, cast a spell or make a ranged attack, and then we climb back up and pull the rope back up. Now if we did that all on our turn, can't we just win combats? So this is a really neat idea. It takes rope trick and uses it in a way that clearly the designers didn't intend. That is really powerful. And it ends up being a really neat idea. Now, is it legal within the rules? Because I was told that if you wanted to disallow this as a DM, it would require a house rule. That is not the case at all. As with most theoretical optimization, this takes what the rules say you can do and what you can't do, looks for the gap, and then makes assumptions in that gap that are not up to the players. And it does this in many different fronts. Let's start with lowering the rope. Does lowering the rope require an action? Does it require a bonus action? Does it require an object interaction? Does it require none of these things? The rope trick spell does not tell us. Now, when I brought up this rule gap to somebody who was telling me that this was a legal trick, they told me that Jeremy Crawford made a tweet saying that in his campaigns he would allow somebody to drop a weapon as a free action, not as an interaction or anything like that, and therefore we can assume the same thing would apply here. Of course we can't assume the same thing would apply here. Dropping a rope down a rope trick might involve coils, it might involve some kind of interaction with the entrance itself. We don't know. The rope trick doesn't tell us. And also, what Jeremy Crawford does in his campaigns isn't rules as written, as theoretical optimizers are constantly telling me. You can't really have it both ways. The second problem here is climbing down 5 feet, casting a spell or using a weapon, and then climbing back up 5 feet. Now the rules say you can move half movement when climbing. They also say that if a rope, let's say you knotted it up, you would need to make a DC 5 athletics check. What it doesn't tell us is how the difficulty class might change if we're equipped with a shield, or if we're using a hand to cast a spell, or if we're using a hand to make an attack, or how hanging on a rope might affect an attack roll we make. These things aren't covered by the rules, and that doesn't mean that there is no impact for those things. We're talking again about what the rules tell us we can do, and the gap between that and what the rules say we can't do. And these fall in that gap. And so what it really comes down to is the DM needs to decide, and the DM needs to decide in a way that makes sense to them. The next thing is, what's required to lift up the rope afterwards? We don't know. And if we look at the text of Rope Trick for some guidance, we see that there are actually no rules for leaving the rope trick before the spell ends. So does that mean you're stuck in the rope trick until the spell is over, and then you're all going to fall out and take damage from falling prone because the rope trick happened to be 60 feet in the air? Well, with an incredibly severe look at rope trick, using rules as written, and if we're assuming that the rules are only telling us what we can or can't do, then yes, then that would mean you can't use the rope trick at all. Because you're stuck in the rope trick until the spell ends, then you're going to fall and take damage. And once again, we see how the gap between what you can do and what you can't do clearly needs some DM interpretation. So the DM can decide if you can leave the rope trick, and if so, is it free? Is it going to take an action? Can you leave the rope trick and come back into the rope trick in the same turn? These are questions unanswered by the spell because they are in the realm of the Dungeon Master to decide. So when we come up with something like the rope trick, we need to understand it's not supported by the rules as written. So it requires DM buy-in. Now, if your DM is going to say that climbing in and out of a rope trick makes sense to me, it makes sense that they can do it in the same turn, it makes sense that they can cast a spell or use a weapon when they're on the rope, and I don't see this being disruptive to my campaign at all, so I am going to make the rules call to allow this. Then it works. But if the DM says, no, I'm going to require that you take an action to come out of the rope trick, and I'm not going to let you come out of the rope trick and go back into the rope trick in the same turn, that is not a house rule. And when I talk about practical optimization, I'm never going to talk about using the rope trick because it is not practical optimization. Here's a much quicker one. The Immovable Object spell. If we look at the Immovable Object spell, you touch an object and it freezes in place. So if we touch, say, one of our enemy's pieces of armor, it's stuck in place and suddenly they're stuck in place. And there's no saving throw with a second level spell. That sounds amazing. In fact, it sounds too good to be true. Guess what? Too good to be true. Why? Well, because the rules don't tell us the difficulty in touching somebody else's specific piece of armor while you're casting a spell in melee. And just because it doesn't tell us doesn't mean that it's automatic. But that's the assumption. The assumption is, well, the rules don't say you can't do that, so therefore you can. But the rules don't say you can do that. So that is, again, we're in that gap between what the rules say you can do and what the rules say you can't do. So if you want to make an attack on somebody and avoid their armor, that requires an attack roll. But if I want to cast a spell and touch somebody's specific piece of armor while I'm in melee, no roll at all, it's automatic. Obviously, that's silly. So this one's a pretty easy one. It's obviously theoretical. It's obviously not supported by the rules as written. That doesn't mean it can't be done. What it means is the DM needs to make a decision on how the mechanics are going to work for something not covered by the rules. And they might decide that you can do it automatic. They might decide that it's going to require some kind of check. Or they might just decide that it's impossible. That touching somebody with your finger in the specific spot that you need to while you're doing the somatic components of this particular spell is impossible within their game. And no matter what they decide, that's fine. Let's talk about another theoretical rules trick. This one is theoretically usable by artificers, called the bag of holding bomb. And I'm going to tell you, to begin with, obviously, the bag of holding bomb is not completely supported by the rules as written. Here is how the bag of holding bomb works. So normally, with artificer infusions, once you take an infusion, you can only use it on one object, and you can't take the same infusion twice. So if you want 2 sets of Boots of the Winding Path, you're going to need 2 artificers. One artificer is not going to be able to accomplish that. Bag of holding is an exception. And this is technically legal by the rules as written, because the replicate magic item infusion is worded in a very specific way. It says specifically you can learn this infusion multiple times. Each time you do so, choose a magic item that you can make with it, picking from the replicable items table below. So I could take 2 infusions, have them both be replicate magic item, and one of those infusions could be a bag of holding, and the other infusion could be a bag of holding. And this doesn't break the rules as written. And because when we create 2 bags of holding this way, we're not using the same infusion more than once, it is legal. Now the bag of holding bomb works this way. Number 1, you're going to get a bag of holding near your enemy. This could be done multiple ways. Maybe you're going to kick it over to your enemy, or you're going to throw it over to your enemy, or you're going to have your familiar drop it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to have the second bag of holding stuffed into the first bag of holding. And how are you going to do this? Well, maybe your familiar stuffs it in, maybe you have an unseen servant stuff it in, maybe you have an animate dead skeleton stuff it in. One way or the other, you're going to have the second bag of holding stuffed into the first bag of holding within 10 feet of your enemies. And then what happens is both items are instantly destroyed, and it opens a gate to the astral plane. And any creature within 10 feet of that gate is sucked through it to a random location on the astral plane. There's no saving throw, so the idea is that if the artificer can do this, what they can do is have this bag of holding bomb occur next to a big enemy, really tough enemy, enemy lich, anything, and they're going to be sucked into the astral plane, no saving throw. Then on the next day, you create 2 more bags of holding, and you can do it again. So this sounds really good. In fact, it sounds too good to be true. So what does that tell us? It probably is, because again, this is one of those things where if we go by the rules as what they tell us we can do, this is not supported. In fact, what needs to happen, as always with theoretical optimization, is we need the DM to make rulings on things that aren't covered in the rules to our favor. Let me explain why. Now, first off, I've seen this presented in ways that makes all kinds of assumptions about the logistics of setting this off that we shouldn't be making as players. To begin with, getting the bag of holding in the right position in the first place. We're going to kick it there. Is it going to get there automatically? Is that going to require an interaction? Can we throw it there? Is that interaction? Is that an action? Does that require some kind of roll? Is our familiar going to drop it? Can our familiar drop it exactly where it needs to go without it bouncing or continuing moving in the direction that the familiar was moving? Or can the familiar even carry it? Do we know that familiars use the same rules as PCs for carrying capacity? Do they use the same rules for PCs for carrying capacity when they're flying, even though that makes no sense? And this comes up a lot too, is when we're talking about the player's handbook, we need to remember that these rules are for players and for player characters. And sometimes those rules refer to a creature, and sometimes those rules refer to you. When it talks about you, it is talking about the PC. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because this is the player's handbook. These are the rules for players. So if it says you, it's talking to a player, not to the DM. Now, that doesn't mean that the DM can't apply those rules to creatures as well, but they are in no way required to, and that is not a house rule. So if we're going to see something that's not covered in the rules and it doesn't make any sense, it seems like folly to assume that the DM is going to make the decision that doesn't make sense. So logistically, there's all kinds of problems here in setting this up in the first place. But the main problem is actually whether bags of holding can be combined in the first place to create this portal. So here's what we know about a bag of holding. We know it's 15 pounds. We know the opening is 2 feet wide. We know the bag is 4 feet deep. And that placing a bag of holding inside an extra-dimensional space created by a handy haversack, portable hole, or similar item instantly destroys both items and opens a gate to the astral plane. Now, obviously, a bag of holding isn't a handy haversack. Obviously, a bag of holding isn't a portable hole. You could, however, claim that it is a similar item. But I will note that specifically, bag of holding isn't mentioned. But if you look at the rules for a handy haversack, bag of holding is mentioned. If you look for the rules for portable hole, bag of holding is mentioned. In all three cases, the same item is not mentioned. Now, did the designers not foresee the possibility that you might want to stick one bag of holding inside of another bag of holding? Or was there a reason they had this exclusion? Or maybe they figured it was obvious because if you're talking about bag of holding, then obviously bag of holding is included. Well, I don't know. The intent of the designers is not clear, but here is what is clear, is that it's not specifically mentioned. We know that this bag is 4 feet deep and has a 2-foot opening. Can you stuff one bag inside another? Well, maybe you can crumple it up. But can bags of holding be crumpled up? We don't know. Rules don't say. So we are in a position where, by the rules as written, the DM must make some judgments that favor the use of this interaction for it to occur for things that are not covered in the rules. And that means that, by the rules as written, this is not legal or illegal. It is under the purveyance of the Dungeon Master. So if your DM says that one bag of holding isn't going to fit into another bag of holding, it's too big and it's not going to fit through the opening, they haven't made a house rule because there's nowhere in the rules that says that you can do that. They are making a judgment for where the rules don't tell them something, and that is their call. And so bag of holding bomb, is it legal by rules as written? The rules alone do not support it. Now, it would be fair to say that I'm being overly technical here, and I would say, of course I am. We're talking about an optimization trick that is potentially game-breaking. So if we're going to claim that as a DM you need to support it because it is supported by the rules, and if you wanted not to use it, you needed a house rule, that is simply false. And that's what I'm pointing out here. Not that if there wasn't a trick involved, I would have an issue with a bag of holding going inside another. But you know what? If there is going to be a game-breaking mechanic, yeah, then that's when I'm going to get super technical. Of course that's why I'm going to get super technical, because you're claiming that it's legal by law, and with any theoretically optimized trick, we're always talking about being super technical in the first place. In order to create that trick, you're looking at the rules with a fine-tooth comb, looking for the technicalities. But when the fine-tooth comb is looked the other direction, we always find holes. And we find the same thing over and over again with all these little tricks that we tend to find. Whether it's the coffee lock in short rest abuse, that's not necessarily supported by the rules. Or we have wrist pocket along with arcane abeyance from the chronologist, that's not necessarily supported by the rules. Or then there's rest tricking, that's when you do a bunch of stuff right before the end of your long rest, and the idea is that at the end of your rest you get all the stuff back and then you can carry all that good stuff into the next day. Again, not necessarily supported by the rules. All this stuff requires the DM to take gaps in the rules where it doesn't tell you how things work and make judgments to your favor, and not always the judgments that make common sense. In fact, in these cases, they are required to make judgments that are way, way against common sense. So how do you know theoretical optimization when you see it? And I would say that there's a few different ways you can use. The most obvious way is doesn't make sense. If it doesn't make sense, there's a good chance it's theoretical optimization. The second thing is does it require a strange interaction with the rules that doesn't seem obvious? That's a good sign. It is theoretical optimization. If whoever posted it or is presenting it is telling you what the rules don't tell them they can't do, that is a good sign we're talking about theoretical optimization. If it seems like it's something that might break immersion, or it seems like it might be something that is going to break a game, or it seems like something that it might be too good to be true, again, we're probably talking about theoretical optimization, or at least going in that direction. And so I do occasionally get asked, in fact, actually fairly often get asked, when am I going to do, say, a coffee lock build or anything that involves theoretical optimization? And the answer is you're not going to see that stuff on this channel very much. And if you ever do, I'm going to be very clear about it at that time. Because what I don't want is for viewers of this channel to see a build that I've presented and then take it to a table only to find out that their DM reacts very negatively to it because it's theoretical optimization and they didn't know it, right? So when you see builds on this channel, when you see the analysis I do on this channel, understand it is practical optimization. This is stuff that you can just take, you can use it at your table, and it should all be legal without having to convince your DM to make some questionable calls. So I hope this is of interest to at least some of my viewers. I understand this is very technical for a lot of the viewers, and so for you, you're probably gone already. But for everybody else, I want to thank you for joining me, and until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next time.